The monarchy did not tremble because of a speech, a scandal, or a public mistake. It trembled because of one signature placed on one document behind closed palace doors. In a private room, away from cameras and ceremony, King Charles signed abdication papers, ending his reign and forcing the palace to confirm the unimaginable. William was now king. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Silence moved through the palace before the announcement did. Aides who normally walked with calm precision suddenly crossed corridors with sealed folders pressed tightly against their chests, their faces drained of the careful confidence the royal household depended on. Charles remained seated after the signing, his hand still close to the pen, as though moving it away would make the decision more real. Abdication papers, in plain terms, are formal documents by which a reigning monarch gives up the throne. And in that room, they did not feel like paperwork. They felt like the end of a lifetime. Charles had waited longer than any modern heir to wear the crown, and that was why the moment cut so deeply. He had spent decades being trained for patience, for duty, for survival under public judgment. Yet now he had ended his own reign not with a balcony appearance or a farewell address, but with a private signature that only a handful of people witnessed. The palace confirmation, a formal statement issued to make the change official, carried one sentence that struck like thunder. William had assumed the throne immediately. That meant there was no pause, no gentle bridge, no time for the family to prepare their hearts before the institution moved on. William received the news without triumph. The prince did not smile, did not speak, and did not reach for the chair offered to him. He simply stood there, stunned by the cruel speed of destiny. He had been raised for this moment, but not like this. Not with his father still breathing through the shock of surrender. Not with Charles sitting alone somewhere nearby, forced to watch the crown pass while the ink on his own signature was barely dry. For William, the title arrived as both victory and wound. Camilla learned after the decision had already crossed the point of return. The queen consort absorbed the confirmation with a stillness that frightened the aides around her, because her silence carried more anger than any outburst could have done. She understood at once that the abdication had not been born in one sudden hour. It had grown through private palace meetings, closed conversations, and decisions made beyond her reach. Charles had signed, William had risen, and Camilla had been told only when the old order was already gone. The signature was only the beginning. Behind that single document stood weeks of fear, pressure, and hidden preparation, and the people closest to Charles were about to discover that the crown had been moving toward this rupture long before the world heard a word. And as the ink dried on the papers, the real shock moved from the document itself to the faces of the people who suddenly had everything to lose. Before the public could absorb the words, "William is king," the private world of the royal family was already cracking. This was not only a constitutional moment, it was a family wound. A father had stepped aside, a son had been forced forward, a wife had been blindsided, and every person inside the palace understood that nothing would ever return to what it had been. Charles had spent almost his entire life waiting for the crown, and that was what made the surrender so devastating. He had been trained to endure criticism, loneliness, delay, and public judgment, but no lesson had prepared him for the pain of letting go after finally reaching the throne. The monarchy had demanded patience from him for decades, yet once he became king, it demanded something even harsher: the courage to step away before the institution cracked under the pressure around him. William did not receive the crown like a man chasing power. He received it like a son forced to walk into a storm while his father was still standing in the rain. The prince understood what the title meant, not only for the nation, but for every private corner of his life. From that moment, every word he spoke would carry the weight of the monarchy. Every silence would be judged. Every decision would echo through the family that had already been wounded by the transfer of power. Camilla sat apart after hearing the confirmation, and her stillness carried its own warning. The queen consort knew immediately that this had not happened around her. It had happened beyond her. The decision had been shaped in rooms she did not control, by conversations she had not led, and by papers she had not seen until the outcome was sealed. Her expression hardened because the loss was not only emotional, it was influence, position, and certainty slipping from her hands all at once. Catherine watched William absorb the news with quiet concern, and she understood the human cost before the ceremonial language could hide it. She reached for his hand before he entered the first emergency briefing as king, not to celebrate him, but to steady him. An emergency briefing, in simple terms, is a fast private meeting where senior officials decide urgent next steps, and this one carried more than procedure. It carried the first breath of a new reign born from heartbreak. Anne had seen the pressure building around Charles long before the world heard anything. The Princess Royal knew her brother was being crushed between loyalty to family and duty to the crown, though even she did not know the exact hour the papers would be signed. Then came the sealed palace note, a private instruction prepared in advance, proving that this was not a sudden collapse. It was planned. It was feared. It was waiting. But the deepest reason behind the abdication was not written in official language or hidden inside sealed folders. It began with one private moment Charles never truly recovered from, a moment when the future stopped asking permission and started moving without him. To understand why a reigning king chose to surrender the crown, the story must move backward to the hidden trigger that made abdication feel inevitable. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks ordinary until history gives it a name. For Charles, that moment came weeks earlier, during a private Windsor briefing, when William placed a sealed succession memorandum on the table and refused to soften the truth. The room fell silent, and Charles understood that his reign was no longer being questioned by critics outside the palace, but by the future inside it. Charles knew before the first sentence was finished that this meeting was different. He had entered expecting pressure, concern, perhaps another warning from advisors who feared the monarchy was drifting into dangerous waters, but he had not expected William to place the sealed memorandum before him with such calm finality. A succession memorandum, in plain words, is a private written plan about how royal power should pass from one monarch to the next. This one carried more than future planning. It carried judgment. William did not raise his voice. That made it worse. The prince spoke with the painful care of a son, trying not to wound his father, while still refusing to protect him from the truth. He explained that the crown could not survive another internal power struggle, not when public trust was already fragile and private divisions were beginning to shape official decisions. Charles listened without interrupting, but every word landed with the force of something he had feared and refused to name. Anne watched her brother closely, and the Princess Royal understood the exact moment his confidence gave way. Charles did not collapse. He did not argue. He simply grew quieter, and that silence told her what anger never could. He realized the room had shifted, not against him as a man, but away from his reign as a solution. Anne had spent her life defending duty above comfort, and even she looked unsettled by the cost of what William was saying. The memorandum revealed the hidden machinery already waiting beneath the surface. It included a transition framework, meaning a prepared structure for transferring authority, schedules, briefings, and royal control if Charles stepped aside. Key legal advisors had already reviewed it, making abdication no longer a whispered fear, but a practical option. Charles saw then that the future had not merely been discussed, it had been organized. That discovery cut deeper than any public criticism ever had. Charles left the briefing without touching the papers again. He walked away, as though distance might weaken their power. But later, when the palace had quieted and the pressure inside him had nowhere else to go, he returned alone. The folder remained where William had left it. The king opened it slowly, turned to the final page, and read it once. Then he read it again. That night became the point of no return. But when Camilla discovered what had happened, the private grief turned into confrontation. The decision may have been shaped in silence, but silence could not survive once Camilla realized the crown was moving without her. The most explosive moment did not happen before Parliament, the press, or the cheering crowds. It happened behind a closed palace door, where Charles and Camilla faced each other without aids, without protocol, and without the protection of royal performance. She wanted answers. He had already made his choice, and between them sat the truth neither of them could escape. Camilla asked for the meeting before the announcement could spread any further through the palace. because she understood what silence meant in royal life. Silence was never empty. It was where decisions hardened, where influence disappeared, where people were told only after the powerful had already chosen the ending. The queen consort entered carrying more than shock. She carried humiliation. Charles had signed abdication papers, formal documents that ended his reign, and she had not been standing beside him when history turned. Charles did not meet her anger with anger. That made the room feel even heavier. He looked like a man who had spent every last reserve of strength before she arrived, and his exhaustion wounded her almost as much as the exclusion. Camilla demanded to know why she had been told after the final signature, why a decision that changed her life had passed through other hands before reaching hers. The king listened, but his silence was not denial, it was confession. Camilla kept her voice controlled, yet every word carried the ache of betrayal. She had stood beside Charles through decades of judgment, through public resistance, through the long road that finally placed him on the throne. Now, at the moment of surrender, she had been left outside the inner circle. Charles told her that the crown had reached a breaking point, and that personal loyalty could no longer outweigh institutional survival. Institutional survival, in simple terms, meant protecting the monarchy itself, even when individual people suffered because of it. Charles then gave her the admission she had been dreading. William had not forced his hand. The prince had not threatened him, cornered him, or staged a rebellion. He had simply shown him the future if he refused to step aside. That was more devastating than pressure, because it meant Charles had looked at the evidence and chosen abdication himself. Camilla heard the truth beneath his words. The old reign had not been stolen. It had collapsed under its own weight. Camilla noticed the folder on the side table before Charles could move it. The counter-signature was already there. The mark that confirmed the document had passed beyond private intention and into official action. A counter-signature is an added approval that makes a major decision harder and often impossible to reverse. She understood at once. There was no pause left to demand, no appeal left to make, no last emotional argument powerful enough to pull the crown back. Charles watched her absorb it, and for one painful moment, neither of them spoke. Their partnership had survived scandal, distance, and public suspicion. But this was different. This was the crown moving on without her permission. This was William becoming the center of the system, while she remained tied to a reign that had just ended. But the confrontation left one question hanging. Who now controlled the machinery of monarchy as William took the throne? As Camilla left the room without another word, the palace began shifting around William with a speed that revealed where real power now lived. Power inside a palace rarely announces itself with thunder. It moves through doors opening, phones ringing, names being crossed out, and new instructions appearing before anyone has time to object. While Charles sat in the shadow of his final act as king, William stepped into a machinery already waiting for him, and every official in the building understood the direction had changed. William entered the emergency administrative meeting, knowing that every face around the table was measuring him. No one applauded. No one softened the air with ceremony. The prince had become king in the space between one signature and one confirmation, and now the palace transition office began moving authority toward him with stunning speed. The transition office, in simple terms, is the group responsible for shifting royal duties, schedules, briefings, and command structures when power passes from one monarch to another. In that moment, it was not preparing for someday. It was acting now. Charles's former seat waited at the head of the table, and William stopped before taking it. That pause said what no official dared to say aloud. He was not merely replacing a sovereign, he was replacing his father while the wound was still fresh. The chair carried history, but it also carried grief. Every file placed before him proved that the monarchy had already adjusted to the new reality faster than the family could. Success had arrived dressed as suffering, and the new king felt both at once. Catherine watched from the edge of the room, and her pride was shadowed by fear. She knew William had been prepared for duty, but preparation was not protection. The crown had not come to him through a steady ceremonial path. It had come through shock, secrecy, and a father's surrender. She saw the way he controlled his breathing before speaking, the way he chose each word, as if one careless sentence could deepen the fracture already running through the family. A senior private secretary then produced the accession schedule, and the room tightened. An accession schedule is a practical plan that sets out the first duties of a new monarch, from briefings, to public statements, to formal approvals. This one was too complete to be improvised. It listed meetings, authority transfers, security changes, and household instructions with the cold precision of something rehearsed before the public knew anything. William understood the meaning instantly. The palace had not merely feared this day, it had prepared for it. Camilla felt the change from another room before anyone fully explained it to her. Her access to certain sovereign briefings was suspended at once, and that suspension carried a brutal message. A sovereign briefing is a private update meant for the reigning monarch and those directly authorized to advise the crown. Under Charles, she had stood close to power. Under William, that closeness no longer applied. Her influence had depended on the reign that had just ended, and now the system was quietly closing doors she once expected to open. William accepted the files, but not the illusion that this was clean. The machinery had chosen efficiency because institutions survive by moving quickly, yet families break because hearts cannot do the same. Charles had stepped aside, Camilla had been pushed outward, Catherine had seen the burden settle, and William had become the center of a monarchy that no longer waited for anyone's grief. The crown had moved cleanly on paper, but inside the royal household, the first casualties of the new reign were already beginning to appear. The first hours of William's reign were not filled with celebration. They were filled with stunned faces, interrupted routines, and rooms where people suddenly understood they belonged to a previous chapter. Clarence House became the emotional center of the fallout, because that was where Charles returned not as reigning monarch, but as a man who had handed history to his son. Charles came back to Clarence House under a quieter rhythm than the one that had surrounded him that morning. The movement around him had changed. The urgency was still there, but it no longer moved toward him. It moved past him. Clarence House, his long-standing royal residence, had always been more than a home. It had been the place where his identity as heir, husband, and monarch had been built over decades. Now it felt like the first room of his aftermath. Every lowered voice told him the same thing. The crown had left before he had fully learned how to live without it. Staff members received new instructions almost immediately, and those instructions made the abdication brutally practical. Titles had to be adjusted. Schedules had to be rewritten. Access had to be reviewed. A household notice, meaning an internal message telling palace staff what roles and rules had changed, was placed before Charles with careful respect. He removed his glasses as he read it, then set the paper down without speaking. The humiliation was not loud. It was worse. It was polite, efficient, and impossible to stop. Camilla stood apart from him, and the silence between them had changed since their confrontation. The queen consort was no longer burning with the same sharp anger. Something colder had settled in its place. She understood that her future had narrowed overnight, not through one public insult, but through a series of quiet removals. Fewer briefings, fewer assumptions, fewer doors opening, because Charles was sovereign. She had not only watched him surrender the throne, she had watched the world built around him begin to shrink around her. William delayed the private call to Charles, and that delay cut deeper because it was not born from cruelty. The prince wanted to speak, but every possible sentence sounded wrong. If he thanked his father, it might sound like victory. If he apologized, it might sound like pity. Charles understood that same trap from the other side. Neither man wanted their first words after the transfer to sound like defeat, so the silence stretched between them, heavy with love, grief, and everything neither could safely say. Anne arrived unexpectedly, carrying the kind of honesty Charles had never been able to dismiss. The Princess Royal did not offer comfort dressed as denial. She told her brother that stepping aside may have been the first decision in years that protected the crown from itself. Charles heard the pain inside the sentence, but also the mercy. Anne was not celebrating his fall. She was naming the sacrifice. Yet the emotional shift could not settle through notices, delayed calls, or even Anne's steady truth. William had inherited the throne, but he had also inherited a wounded father. And before the nation could fully accept William as king, The new monarch had to face the father, whose crown he had inherited. The turning point came not in a council chamber, but in a private room where two men stood without the armor of monarchy. Charles was no longer the sovereign. William was no longer only the heir. For the first time, father and son had to speak plainly about duty, regret, and the terrible cost of a crown that had shaped both their lives. William chose to go to Charles before facing the nation, because he understood that no public address could carry truth if the private wound remained untouched. The transition orders had already moved through the palace, shifting authority, briefing control, and royal command into his hands. Transition orders, in simple words, are official instructions that tell staff and institutions how power should move from one reign to the next. They had made William king on paper, but they had not made him ready in his heart. For that, he had to face the man who had just surrendered everything. Charles waited without ceremony, and that absence of royal distance made the meeting harder. No aides entered. No private secretary guided the language. No official stood nearby to soften the pain. Catherine remained outside, giving the moment the privacy it demanded, because she knew William could not step fully into history while still carrying words unsaid to his father. Inside, the prince faced Charles not as a replacement, but as a son, trying to understand the grief behind the crown's sudden fall. Charles spoke first, and his honesty changed the air between them. He told William that he had never imagined surrendering the throne would feel both shameful and merciful at the same time. Shameful, because a king is raised to endure until the end. Merciful, because he had felt the monarchy bending under strain and knew that refusing to move could damage everything he had once hoped to protect. Charles did not ask for praise. He did not ask to be rescued from judgment. He simply needed his son to know that letting go had not been weakness alone. It had been agony wrapped in duty. William answered slowly, holding back the emotion that threatened to break through. He told Charles that abdication did not erase his service. Abdication, meaning the formal act of giving up the throne, had ended a chapter that had become too heavy, but it had not erased the decades of waiting, working, and carrying the family through storms. The words did not heal everything. They could not. But they gave Charles something the palace machinery had not offered him: dignity. Charles then handed William a handwritten note prepared before the signing. It contained advice he had not been able to say aloud during the final meeting. Words meant for a king, but written by a father. William did not read it immediately. He placed it inside his jacket, choosing presence over protocol, choosing his father over the document in that fragile minute. Their private understanding did not remove the public storm waiting beyond the gates, but it gave William the strength to step into it. And when William finally stepped from private grief into public history, the world was already deciding what this abdication meant. By dawn, the abdication was no longer a palace secret. It was on every screen, every front page, and every trembling conversation outside the gates. The country had gone to sleep under Charles and awakened under William. Yet the public reaction was not simple celebration. It was shock, sorrow, fascination, and the strange silence that follows history arriving too quickly. Mourning did not soften the blow. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming with formal coverage, confirming that Charles had abdicated and William was now king, and the words sounded unreal even as they were repeated again and again. Abdicated, in plain language, means a monarch has formally given up the throne, and that single act had moved the crown from father to son overnight. For viewers at home, the shock was not only that William had risen, it was that Charles had stepped away so suddenly, before the country had even learned how to understand his reign. The palace issued a short, controlled statement soon after, and every line was built to calm the nation. It spoke of continuity, stability, and William's immediate assumption of sovereign duties. Sovereign duties, meaning the official responsibilities of the monarch, included the daily briefings, approvals, and ceremonial authority that now belonged to him without delay. But the statement could not hide the emotional force behind the transition. Its language was steady, yet the country felt the tremor underneath. Charles had not simply changed his schedule, he had changed history. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace in the cold morning air, drawn there by disbelief more than celebration. Some held flowers. Others stood with phones in their hands, reading the same headline, as if repetition might make it easier to accept. The palace gates became a place of shared silence, where strangers looked at one another and understood they were witnessing a break in the royal story. One elderly woman wiped her eyes and said, "I thought I would never see this in my lifetime." Her words carried the feeling of thousands, awe mixed with grief, loyalty mixed with confusion. Newspapers moved faster than emotion could settle. A major London front page appeared, with a stark black and white image of Charles, and the brutal headline, "The King Steps Down." The phrase landed harder than any palace wording, because it stripped the moment to its core. A man who had waited decades to reign had chosen to leave. A son who had prepared his whole life had been pulled forward by crisis. Success and suffering had arrived together, locked in the same historic hour. One broadcaster framed William's accession as both a rescue and a rupture, calling it the most emotionally complex royal transition of the modern age. Accession, simply put, is the moment a new monarch takes the throne. But this accession did not feel clean or triumphant. It felt like survival, bought at a painful price. Beyond the headlines, one final judgment remained. Whether Charles had fallen, or whether he had saved the monarchy by letting go. As the nation absorbed the shock, the final meaning of the abdication began to settle not in politics, but in the hearts of those who had watched the crown change hands. In the end, the abdication was not merely the collapse of a reign. It was the painful transfer of responsibility from a father who could carry no more, to a son who could no longer wait. Charles left the throne wounded, William accepted it burdened, and the monarchy survived by admitting what it rarely admits. Even kings reach the end of their strength. Charles sat with the silence of a man who had finally stopped fighting history. The crown had once been his destination, the proof of endurance after decades of waiting, but now it had become the burden he chose to release before it damaged everything around him. Abdication, in plain words, means a monarch formally gives up the throne, and for Charles, it did not feel like escape. It felt like sacrifice. It changed titles, households, loyalties, and the private balance of a family already shaken by too many hidden fractures. William understood that his first hours as king could not be shaped by emotion alone. The prince had to project discipline, stability, and control, because the country had just witnessed a royal rupture no one expected. A formal address, meaning the first official message from a monarch to the public, would have to calm fears without pretending the pain did not exist. Catherine stood beside him before that moment, steady and watchful, knowing he was not stepping into triumph. He was stepping into duty, carved from his father's humiliation. Charles accepted the truth slowly. The machinery of kingship no longer surrounded him, and that absence revealed the man beneath the role. He had not ended his reign in emptiness. He had ended it before the crown broke beneath him. That was the cruel mercy of the moment. The king had lost power, but he had preserved meaning. He had surrendered the throne, but not the purpose that had shaped his life. Camilla felt the finality in ways no statement needed to spell out. The queen consort's role had been permanently altered, and the palace confirmed it not through open punishment, but through quiet action. Briefings moved elsewhere. Assumptions disappeared. Access narrowed. Her influence had survived through Charles's reign, and once that reign ended, the world around her changed with brutal speed. Anne's loyalty to the institution now looked less severe and more prophetic. The Princess Royal had warned that stability had to come before comfort, and now her harshest truths sounded like protection. William did not smile before the address. Catherine did not ask him to. They both knew the crown had arrived through sorrow, but sorrow had not made him weak. Charles's reign ended in pain, but not emptiness. William's began in grief, but not defeat. The monarchy endured because one king stepped aside before sentiment destroyed survival. The papers were signed in secrecy, but their meaning became unmistakable. Charles gave up the throne, William inherited the burden, and the monarchy chose survival over sentiment. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.